Hello, so I am co-founder and CEO of Carnivore, but I think really the most relevant aspect of our bio is who we are to each other. Lever is our lead investor in the seed round that we're just closing. So Yachi is now a member of the Carnivore team, and we're a member of the Lever portfolio.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm really honored to be here. I'm a partner at LeverVC. We are an early stage fund that invests in the alternative protein space almost exclusively. We invest globally in the early stages of pre-seed, seed, all the way to Series B, and across all types of protein production companies, plant-based, fermentation, and most importantly, cultivated meat. And yeah, happy to share more about our experience. And I think this panel or this fireside chat is for Virginia and myself to talk about this, our experience closing this seed round from both perspectives.
All right, so certainly we can take questions at some point, but maybe we can start by going over the basic contours of the process from both of our perspectives.
Yeah, I think we'll probably halfway in, we'll start to see if there are any urgent questions, and if not, we'll just continue chatting, but feel free to raise your hands at any point.
Sounds good to me. Okay, so we started raising at the beginning of this year. We set out to raise $5 million, and it did not turn out as expected. We ended up raising $7 million, in large part because Lever was a very, very useful lead investor, and they helped us make connections to some investors who we believe are going to be very excellent value adds. And so we were in the enviable position of having to tell people that there wasn't enough allocation left and that we would hopefully see them next round. And really one thing that was instrumental in getting that process rolling was securing our lead investor, and crucially, that lead investor being someone who inspired confidence in other investors in the field. First, because I think a lot of smaller investors either don't have the internal bandwidth to do their own deep dive due diligence, and second, because I think we spoke to a lot of funds that were really interested in getting into this sector, but were very wary at the same time of cultivated meat. As we've heard so much today, I think there are a great many people who are increasingly bearish, or who are at least very cognizant of the fact that technology differs wildly from company to company, and you really do need the expertise to be able to vet the technology. And so securing a lead investor who had done this incredible deep dive and who actually has a permanent internal SciTech team, and crucially, Lever was also willing to share their deal memos, which I think many people found very helpful, was an essential part of bringing in investors who either maybe would have passed because they didn't have the bandwidth in their own team to come out to Chicago and do the vetting themselves, or because they were very aware of the fact that they were not area experts.
I'd like to share a bit about how the conversations went on our side, and what really got us excited. But to start that off, Virginia, would you like to share a bit about what, in your mind, differentiates Carnivore? I think
Sure.
Just in case some of the audience are not super familiar with the company just yet.
Of course, certainly. So I will say that we are as we learned in the process of this, what is considered to be a full stack cultivated meat company. And we did have several investors say, we're very concerned about investing in full stack cultivated meat companies right now. There's a lot of risk at every level. And so I think we had to prove ourselves all the more. But really our differentiators hinge on the technology. So we were talking about this earlier. We would have many intro calls, my co-founder and CSO and I. We're both academics by background, and so we would start the conversation and immediately lead in with the science. So media cost, scalability, our cell lines, and we would have investors very frequently say, okay, wait a minute, so tell us your story. Tell us the narrative, what's the founding narrative of this company? How did you get interested in this field? And so I think we were very gratified when we first started talking with the Lever team that they do very much foreground the technology. Because not that the founding narrative does not matter, but to us, our differentiators were clear, and they were media costs, and scalability?
Yeah, so on our side, when we first came across Clever Carnivore, I think our science tech team had the first call.
The first 2 calls, which
yeah.
we also appreciated.
And I remember our first deal team meeting, we're like, oh, we just came across this company in Chicago, newly founded cultivated meat company. We've been in this space for a long time now, and we specialize in this, so we've looked at almost all the cultivated meat companies that are currently in the market now, and so we think we know the landscape quite well. And what our science tech team said was their media cost is at this level, which is potentially orders of magnitude lower than many incumbent competitors. And our team's reaction was immediately, well, that's too good to be true. It's probably not true. So then that definitely went through the deal team's mind, and we were like, okay, we really need to validate this, because if it is true and if it is this differentiated, that's a game changer in this industry, and we would definitely be interested. So then from that point on, we know the science tech and actually validating the technologies and the claims that the science tech team on Clever Carnivore side was making is the key decision point. And our science tech team then took the first 2 calls, but then many more calls afterwards, and a lot of back and forth of different rounds of Q&A to really validate that point. And from that point on, the business side is relatively easy. We, again, are a specialist investor. We focus on this space, and as a full stack company, we didn't have to do too much. Well, we talked about hybrid versus fully cultivated product, but then our focus was really on the science tech side. So then I think the expansion of that, I think, to a lot of people here and to other people developing cultivated meat technologies, I think this is an incredibly difficult time. But then the point is also, what are really your differentiation point? You should really be ready to talk to investors and be able to articulate those points, because there are quite a number of companies out there now, and if your differentiation is not clear, that could be a problem, and you really can't just blame the market for it. In a market that is more of a bubble, of course, first tier, second tier, third tier companies all get funded at good valuations, but now we're just simply back to the ground. I wouldn't say that it's a grim market. Just as in this example, I think Virginia was saying earlier that it might be an outlier, that they had a relatively easy time securing this round, but because they have had a really clear differentiation. So if you don't have that, I would really recommend thinking about that within your tech stack and within your strategies, and it could also just be opportunities for consolidation and thinking about alternative ways to move into the next phase when the market now is more back to the reality.
And I think the other thing we anticipated going into this too is that actually my co-founder, as a consultant, participated in vetting companies years ago in various different fields, and he was always shocked at what to him seemed like very few milestones met, very limited accomplishments that were still having quite a lot of funding thrown at them. And I think we knew going into this, with so much conversation about the bear market and a difficult fundraising climate, that the expectations were higher. The other thing we noted is that now that regulatory hurdles have been cleared by Upside and Good Meats, the next question in line is scalability. So people were much more willing to say, okay, so we buy that cultivated meat can pass regulatory clearance. We're no longer as concerned about that as a risk factor, but within a heartbeat, okay, so the next question is, can this actually scale? And so I think to us, that was a significant advantage, because as a relatively small early stage company, of course, we didn't have the funding of Upside and Good Meat to work on things like regulatory inroads or lobbying or doing our own internal polling on consumer acceptance, but ability to scale, that we can demonstrate.
Yeah, And that's an incredible point. And Virginia, what did you think were the more challenging parts of this fundraising process?
Well, again, I think I would say continuing to run a company while you are going through the fundraising process, because certainly it's a very time-consuming effort. I will also say I am not a natural networker. This is not my environment. And in fact, one of the reasons that we brought on Caitlin Grady, our Director of Strategic Partnerships, is because I try to hire people who complement my skill set. And so really, to be perfectly honest, did not have a LinkedIn at the beginning of this year. I know, it sounds insane now. And frankly, did not really have any connections to VCs of any kind, was not really well networked up with the alt protein space in general. Again, my co-founder and I came from academia. And so we had been given very good advice that you just have to be tenacious and you have to effectively play the numbers game, right? That you're going to contact maybe 200 VCs and maybe you get a request for a pitch deck and intro meeting from 100 of them. You have, some preliminary meetings, and then it's kind of the funnel down from there. And that was our experience, that we really, Caitlin and I reached out to innumerable people on LinkedIn and through other avenues. And I think, obviously, it was a significant learning process for us as well to think about, okay, so maybe this is a good Series A contact, but they're a growth investor, they're not interested in us now. And so maybe our knowledge was kind of more rudimentary starting out than it might be for many of you. But I think learning while you're raising and being flexible and being tenacious, all of this was a challenge.
Yeah, it's definitely a numbers game, and networking is really, really key. And I think it's really important, especially for many cultivated meat companies started by scientists and scientific teams, that to understand the importance to get out there, to both get your message out there and introduce your company to the market, as well as to just talk to investors, talk to other industry players, and later on you're going to start talking to customers, and which I highly recommend starting a lot of those processes very early. One thing that I keep seeing in a lot of science-tech-driven companies is that people have hypotheses that are completely untested. When testing it might not even be that difficult, especially if, say, Clever Carnivore is a full stack company, so it's slightly less relevant. But if you're a service company, if you're providing any input into the cultivated meat company, you come to this type of conferences and you should be reaching out to those full stack companies or other to-be customers, potential to-be customers of yours, to understand when you have this value proposition and this thing that you're looking to sell, how much demand is there for it? How do people react to it, and what type of question they're asking you? And these are some of the kind of like baseline information that people expect when you're starting a startup, to have some type of commercial strategy that is grounded in reality and backed up by customer interviews per se. And so I strongly recommend doing a lot of that. And another aspect is, I think we talked about how for a lot of entrepreneurs, the venture space and the venture process is very opaque, and you don't really always know where to start and what really goes on behind closed doors, what conversations are happening among the investment teams at the VC fund that you're talking to after you have had your meetings with them. There are a lot of resources out there about venture investing, and a lot of venture investors are looking at those resources, and I would say it's just general good practice for entrepreneurs to follow those too. There are well-written books out there that are relatively basic, textbook version about what investors are looking for when they're looking at a seed deal. And I just strongly recommend entrepreneurs at least spending some time reading that. It takes, a week to finish a book like that, and then you have a baseline understanding of investors are looking for defendable market size that is large enough for for a venture fund to get a decent return from it. They're looking at the team and the way that the cap table is set up, the way that your team's interacting with each other, and they're looking for that science-tech differentiation. To name a few, but I would just say that to start with some of those basic research, it's well worth your time, and it's not that difficult.
Oh, certainly, and we did quite a lot of reading, quite a lot of Googling, quite a lot of asking for free advice from anyone who would give it to us, and I will say, on the whole, yes, absolutely, doing your own due diligence is very important, but one piece of advice that James Kafin, Yachi's colleague, gave me recently was probably a piece of advice that I had to hear because I had been preparing so diligently going into the process and was so aware of sort of all of the things that the VCs would want to hear about and making sure I checked all of those boxes. And so I would go through every possible thing that you could have to ask about Clever Carnivore, and then I would finish with, and certainly if you have any questions about our IP strategy or about our possible exits, and would give this whole litany of, ask me anything about X, Y, and Z. And James kind of said, going forward, you can assume that these are going to be longitudinal conversations, and so allowing it to be more of a conversation and giving them the opportunity to ask questions and assuming that you'll have a chance to offer all of this information on subsequent calls as opposed to treating it as though I have to demonstrate to you that I have all of my facts lined up and basically kind of force feed it to you all in one.
Yeah. But I'm sure those exercises were really helpful for
you have
preparing
to
you
know these things.
Yeah,
it's just a question of, being thoughtful about how you present them, I guess.
Right, yeah. So understanding what are the questions that are going to come up, they really shouldn't surprise you all that much that someone's asking you about your differentiation, your go-to-market strategy, and don't answer with just, oh, that's a good question. I'd be interested in your advice. We get that sometimes, and it's good to hear that open-mindedness, but also would expect entrepreneurs to have some good, well-thought-out answers themselves as well. Should we see if there are any burning questions in the audience?
Absolutely. I will say one more useful piece of advice that I got from the Lever team. This was actually from the third partner, Nick Cooney, so everyone has been very helpful to us throughout this process. As I mentioned, I'm not a natural networker. I don't love going to conferences and doing undirected socializing. And we had been invited to give a talk at Future Food Tech NY, and I had mentioned to Nick Cooney, I'm thinking of just sending Caitlin alone. I know that we had been asked to both do this, but it's expensive. What is the point of, paying for a hotel in Times Square? We're a very frugal company. And he said, look, the fact of the matter is, at this point, relationships with founders matter. And so you're not yet at the stage at which you can send representatives of the company. Certainly having additional people there is great, but at the end of the day, investors want to get to know the founders. And I think that was an interesting aspect of the conversations. Once you get past maybe the first stage and the second stage, that you ultimately get to this sort of getting to know you and vetting you, and you got the strong sense that they were trying to make sure that Paul and I were not absolutely unreasonable people who would be impossible to work with.
Yeah. So while we talked about how we started with the science-tech process, many of the team members actually went to Chicago to visit and spend half a day or full day there, and that's very intentional. It is to get to know the founders, to have those face-to-face time so that we know you as people and how you're going to be working with us. But people could also take that proactive approach. Pretend that you're going to be in the city that the investor who you're really pursuing, who's not super responsive but seem interested, be in their city, get coffee. Face-to-face does go a long way. It's just, I'm naturally introverted as well, but this is what we go through as a fund in the fundraising process as well, and it's just human nature that you can't avoid. With that, maybe we'll see if there are any questions.
for that. Interesting to see kind of the story from the founder side. Been on that side too. Been on the other side a little bit too. I wanted to ask specifically to you, Yachi, is that?
Yachi.
Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself as well?
I'm Eiki Rapsson, come from Iceland. I'm doing a startup myself on the cultivated fish side. Compared to funding companies in other high-tech industries for software, hardware, that sort of thing, what's the difference for you in investing in these types of companies compared to something like that? I can see from my perspective that looking into the cost of these companies, a little bit unfair to the scientists, but you get underpaid compared to the software engineers that I know. That must have some relevance to how these companies are funded from a cost perspective. But what is the difference between funding a biotech company like the Cultivated startups are versus the traditional VC kind of that we all know from Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so the question is essentially how does funding a cultivated meat company compared to funding software?
Yes, both from the perspective of the scale and also the timeline. What does it mean for you? Because one of the things you said, differentiation, obviously, your go-to-market, when is the go-to-market for this? It's completely different from software.
Yeah, I would definitely say that they are quite different, and if anything, cultivated meat company is more resemblant of what people now call deep tech company, and with higher capex requirement, longer time to market, and those are really important factors. And I would say in our case, how we're thinking about it, this is again something that I do think as founders look into more of the basic information that venture investors actually consider and think through. One book I would recommend is just really basic, called Venture Deals. The book is actually talking about how to be smarter than your lawyers and than your investors about the venture process. And I would say the differences are those strong high capex requirement and how the timeline really line up. And for us, in looking at the timeline, I think it is important to think about what your investors are going through themselves as well. We raise 10-year funds that are supposed to have an exit at the end of that. Some can still get distributed, but you would want to see some form of exit through the fund. And so when we're investing, we do want to see that in our company as a potential. So if your go-to-market strategy is something that is going to be in 7 years, you're gonna start trying to launch some product, that might just make you somewhat unsuitable for a venture strategy. And that's kind of the reality of it. And I think in terms of the high capex requirement and more capital needed to actually get to that point, we do a pretty comprehensive modeling of the financial projections based on how many rounds there are going to be, how much money you have to raise, what does that mean for us in terms of dilution, and go from there in terms of that market return potential. And then market return potential ties in what I was talking about earlier about the importance of market size, which I think cultivated meat company, all of you should be able to make a strong case that we're working in this market that is $3 trillion worldwide. It's a huge market. There should be the potential to have a large addressable market, and that part shouldn't be the bottleneck. But to think through that from the company level, I would say is important because that's the math we're going through on our side.
Yeah, and I will say too, I think one thing that weighed strongly in our favor, certainly VCs are aware that this is not an industry where your overheads are effectively paying engineers to sit in a room and code. You do buy bioreactors and tissue culture hoods, et cetera. These startup costs are substantial, but we were called scrappy by quite a few different investors, and they seemed to really appreciate that we weren't just buying off-the-shelf bioreactors. We bought things on eBay, and our team kind of cobbled them together. So they appreciated that we were, where possible, very cost-conscious.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Doug.
I cut Doug off last time, so we got to let's hand it over to Doug. But that'll be the last question.
Oh, we popped each other. Doug Grant, Atlantic Fish Co. This is a great presentation. Thank you guys both for doing this. The Lever white papers that you guys have done are great resources. I actually forward those to investors. They're like, we don't really understand the space. It's got great metrics. Is there anything you would emphasize more if you guys were writing that now, or add, or other metrics for seed stage, A round, et cetera? Have those changed at all or evolved?
Since the white paper came out, I would say not necessarily, but the really high-level things are cost and scalability. Those are what I would say are the key factors. And then obviously when it comes to cost, a few of different those performance metrics. If you haven't seen it, we're talking about like productivity and the cell density and doubling time and so on, and how based on the companies that we've seen in the market, how we would benchmark them within the scale of other competitors in the market. And so all of those contribute to cost. And if you figure out one thing, one lever that's able to really, that you're able to pull that make you significantly more competitive on one of those fronts, I think any of those can justify you as a very differentiated company. And I guess while we're on that point and have a couple minutes, since we put out that white paper, we've had companies like come back to us and being like, based on your white paper and based on your benchmark, we are like exceptional on all these metrics because in 3 years we're going to be here. We're like, well, that's not really the point. so I think that's a fine way to approach investors, and I also think that from what I've seen in other companies, they've been able to leverage our white paper to make a case to other investors who are not specialists in this space, generalist investors, and I think that is a good way to go, and I do encourage you all to take a look there as well, but just when you're also speaking with investors that are more entrenched in this space, just be more upfront and actually, like, you don't need to be exceptional on all fronts. You need to be exceptional on some fronts, but then that should be something that you've achieved rather than aspirational.
And I think along those lines, I mean, certainly if you have a lot of trade secret IP, you have to be as careful as you possibly can, but I would say it was always helpful to be as transparent as possible at every stage of the process. So it seemed like once we had someone actually come and visit and see the lab and now taste the product, that is always going to be the most compelling thing at the end of the day, to be able to say, you know, this isn't just data that we could potentially have tweaked or cherry-picked. You know, you can come to the lab and see how many bioreactors we have up and running, and you can see the cell density, you can look at some cells under a microscope.
Absolutely, and I think in Clever Carnivore's case, the too good to be true that we started with, we're able to validate through and through with the team, and we're probably being quite a pain in the neck, but that really just instilled so much more confidence in the company, and that we have been just so excited about it ever since.
And, yeah, I will say not at all a pain in the neck, in fact, because our scientists are always excited to talk to other scientists, and in fact, sometimes I felt that I had to be on the call just to make sure that they weren't telling them anything that was too proprietary, but yes, they really did enjoy the science-forward approach because they love talking to other scientists, and we certainly appreciated the hands-on approach and appreciated the fact that the work product at the end of it was so useful in helping us secure other investment because it does truly inspire confidence.
Yeah, and as a last word, I think none of this is to say it's not a challenging time. It is a very challenging time to fundraise. But I think that is also why you really need to face the reality that investors are not on as much of a rush timeline to close, and you'll feel more of the urgency than the investors would. When a few years ago, it might be the reverse because investors are competing to get into the deal. And maybe you can, at that point, pull one over on investors and not give full answers and just be like, have faith in us, and that could have been sufficient. Now it's not at that time, and investors are going to take their time and to validate your claims. And if your claims are not firm and not solid, it could just come back and bite you. And so just start on a solid ground and go from there.
Yeah, this was fun. I think we could go for another quite a long time. So thank you for having us.
Thank you.